Europe didn't want this war. Europe didn't look for this war. Europe doesn't want to divert its scarce resources towards a conflict that it didn't choose to support.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm very, very happy today to be with my good friend from Europe, Matthew Astill. Matthew, welcome.
Thank you, Charles. Very, very nice. Nice to see you again.
Are
Yeah,
you in the UK now?
yeah. So I'm in the UK.
What is happening in the UK? For example, there's reports of rationing of vegetables at supermarkets. Is that true?
Number one, we should not all believe the headlines we read. But but number two, yes, the continued sort of dislocations of frankly what happened with Brexit continue to play out in the UK. And if you disconnect a country from its primary trading partner, where more than 50 odd percent of its trade goes backwards and forwards, and you create a complex set of new rules and regulations, which deters investments, combined with the rather obvious dislocation in the European energy market as a result of Ukraine, which has a big impact on growing of certain food produce. These two factors together have created some, I use the word dislocations in supply chain. But Charles, all I can say is that don't read all the headlines. And if you walked about 10 meters into my kitchen, you'll see lots of tomatoes, lots of cucumbers, and lots of lettuces. So it's not all disaster. But I suppose we first got we first had this unimaginable events taking place during the pandemic of supply chain problems, which we were just not used to in a generation. And so everybody's still conscious of these issues, and the media really highlight these issues. But frankly, this really is this is about the cost of energy and some producers turning off production.
What about the English, UK's economy overall? How does it look? Inflation seems to be still quite strong.
Unquestionably, we've got slightly elevated levels of inflation compared to our European counterparts. Unquestionably, the UK is sort of bottom of the G7, G8 league at the moment. We're going through a bit of a psycho crisis at the moment, in all kinds of ways. It's still really the politics that's driving a large part.
Okay, let me stop UK bashing.
No. Charles, you can ask me anything, because I mean the UK is, everything we do is on display, right? What's happening is played out, and so it's possible that things look worse than they are. I feel obliged to say this, but obviously the UK's got wonderful strengths that will sustain itself through. I mean, I had some interesting discussions in the last few weeks with people close to what potentially will be the next administration in the UK. Our political cycle is going to turn again. There has to be an election by January 25, which probably means an election in the next 18 months. And we're coming to the end of an exhausted government of the Conservative Party, who've been in power for 15 years, arguably too long. And so there'll be a big renewal. There'll be a sense of a change of direction coming in a year and a half from now. But yeah, it's not been our best couple of years. I agree. Next.
No, sitting from where I am, I say that we're quite pessimistic about the prospects for the UK after Brexit. It's digging a huge hole and jumping into it. And there continues to be all kinds of ramifications. Like you said, the regulatory framework needs to be totally revised, and it's very complicated. And then, of course, the Ukraine situation with energy prices and so on. But yeah. Now,
let me just say one final comment. Again, however bad things look, because of media, we all play out everything second by second, minute by minute. It seems to me, and to most people, of course, politically, I thought it was a catastrophic decision to leave the EU, obviously, except fully that was a decision that was taken. But over a period of time, I think we can expect to see that the UK will settle into a new relationship with its European partners. If it's not exactly a replicate of somewhere like Norway, it's going to be something similar. So whilst there's no possibility of the UK going back into the EU for a generation, there will be a concerted attempt to end the economic damage. So the next, but it won't happen for another year and a half until things.
Hopefully, it becomes a collaborative, productive relationship for
Yeah,
all.
but I mean, let me ask you a question. What do you think the most positive aspect has been for the repairing of the UK's relationship with Europe?
No, I can only talk about Europe from the Chinese perspective. One thing that I was going to talk about, but I did not, was that
Yeah.
greater unity among European nations. But is it to become a more independent political force of Europe, or
Yep.
is it unified behind America? There's a distinct difference there.
Yeah, there is, and I think it's unclear at the moment. I think it's part of I think that's probably part of a bigger trend, isn't it? Where the next 10 years is about leverage, advantage, and nation states acting, if they're strong enough individually or probably more likely collectively, playing a game of, where have we got a strategic advantage over you? Where have we got leverage over you? Where do our interests intersect? And Europe, still fundamentally lacks a strategy as to where it has a very good united trade position, which that on a European Union level, trade policy is negotiated by sovereignty, is completely ceded to super Europe at a pan-European level, and some could argue it's really effective. Again, back to Brexit, which is the stupidity of the European Union, which is however many times bigger than the UK, going into a trade negotiation in China or India or even Australia. Economic might is right, isn't it, in a trade negotiation? So the question is for the European Union, is it capable of acting in a more strategic manner? Is it capable of thinking about it's acting in a more unified and concerted way? Again, if you the position of Germany is kind of integral to all of this. People expect a lot of Germany. People want a lot from Germany. Germany's in a extraordinary bind in some respects because it had an entire sort of a national policy based on cheap gas from Russia and exporting all its capital goods to China.
Yes.
And that's the bottom line.
It worked very well for a long time.
Suddenly, in a heartbeat, moving away from that is an extraordinary challenge for Germany. I have a personal view. I love seeing Germany back. Militarily increasing its budgets. I love seeing Germany, being, albeit in small steps, albeit everybody's frustrated, and albeit everybody wants it to do more. If Europe stands any chance of being a strong political force, then Germany has to be a stronger international geopolitical force, which historically it's clearly been, reluctant to ever always be.
I think politically speaking, there's no question that China is not in favor of a weaker Europe. China would like to see a stronger Europe, but not independent in terms of its foreign policy and geopolitics and so on, instead of being led by the US completely. There are differences of interest which is now being shown within Europe as well, including within countries in Europe. Differences of political opinion.
True, and that will always be part of, by definition, the nature of the political democracies that we live in. And that. So, Charles, the question is, that there is at times it feels like a very a unified American opposition to China, cross-party. We've seen this just coming in since sort of 2016. It's becoming ever stronger, and clearly Ukraine has totally changed the dynamic. I think I'd perhaps sometimes it might be difficult for not you, Charles, obviously, but for some of my friends in China who I speak to all the time, to appreciate quite what a psychological and political change the Ukrainian war is. There's war again on the soils of Europe. America is by far the biggest power now, again, in terms of militarily supporting the Ukrainians, which the Europeans are completely unified behind. And so whilst this situation exists, inevitably the European are going to fall in line with America to much larger extent than possibly they would do without Ukraine. So whilst Ukraine is a reality, then Europe is going to be tucked underneath the US wing, and that's an inevitability, and I don't see any way around that.
Politically, it's for Europe because the war is on the continent of Europe. So
And nobody, I
politically,
mean, nobody wants it. Yeah, but it's again. I try and I spent lockdown, as you know, doubling down with my China network, which I've it's been a privilege to be able to sort of live in for the last 20 years. So I still spend 3 or 4 hours of every day, on WeChat and calls with you, Charles, or calls with our friends, trying to do business, just trying to keep things alive between my European and Chinese connections. And I try and explain to people that, the really profound impact that the Ukraine thing has had. So I'm talking to you today from, I'm out of London. I'm in where we live in the countryside in the middle of nowhere, and in the villages all around here. And I'm looking at green fields, and the villages of 200, 300, 400 people. There are 20 or 30 of them all nearby. There will be Ukrainian families, mothers and children living in all these villages. This is happening all over Europe. This has really, really had a profound impact on Europe. Europe didn't want this war. Europe didn't look for this war. Europe doesn't want to divert its scarce resources towards a conflict that it didn't choose to support.
okay,
But I right or wrong, I'm not arguing. I'm not going to get into that. I'm just trying to explain to any of my friends in China what a profound impact this has had.
absolutely. I can feel it from you and from many friends in Europe. Now, in terms of European-China relations, you've touched on that. For us in China, we just want to do business
Yeah,
with the Europeans. Now you have enhanced efficiency. That's a good thing. You're more competitive in terms of energy use. That's a good thing. But also a lot of industries have moved out of Europe into other parts of the world. And principally what we've seen in terms of generalized numbers, quite a bit has moved to the US, and a number have actually moved to China. In terms of German investments in China, especially in manufacturing industrial investment, it's actually increased by 40-some% over the
yep,
year before.
yep.
So what is happening on that?
If you're BASF, or you're a electric car maker, or you're a traditional car maker, and you're German, you clearly there's only one place to be, China. And there is a prevailing sense of panic around Europe at the moment about what the American stimulus, which the Inflation Reduction Act, is going to. People suspect that in the end, this is going to be a sort of 2 trillion. When you put private investments in, it's going to be 2 trillion level of stimulus. America has got the wind in its sails big time at the moment. It really has. And so we in Europe are seeing delegations coming from, state by state, the commercial trade departments in all kinds of provinces, on towns and cities, coming around Europe, trying to encourage European investment, and it's working. So yes, you're right. And it's a real fear of policymakers at the moment that for the energy transition, that America is just going to hoover up investment. And there's that on a policy to policy basis, there's discussions going on at the moment about how Europe has got to this is potentially protectionist trade policies. This is nationalist nationalist trade policies that could have a severe impact on the European economy. So I would expect Americans and Europeans, driven by this sort of united approach really coming from Ukraine, that there'll be versions of the Inflation Reduction in a European context coming in. There's bound to be some sort of reciprocal measures. Keep European companies here.
Absolutely. Europe has no choice but to do this because what the US is doing is basically protectionist, anti-free trade, anti-market, government interference, including sanctions on China. It's the same thing. But the impact on European companies is going to be the same. For example, on electric vehicles, a certain percentage, very high percentage of the components have to be made in the US before you can sell it in the US. And that's going to impact all the German and actually Japanese and Korean car makers. And the impact can be very substantial. So if you're going to subsidize your industry, you're going to do exactly what you criticize China for. I think Europe will have to counter with its own things.
It's a pretty radical vision that's going on in the US right now. And it's attempting, as I'm sure you probably explained to everybody, but it is attempting to, one, decarbonize the US economy in one, foul swoop. As at the same time, it's looking to reshore significant amounts of industry, and it is looking to rebalance and rebase the US economy, and to look at trying to address the sources of social discontent. And thirdly, frankly, it is looking at a disengagement with China, and it is trying to break a sort of US-China
the disengagement, again, in terms of reshoring as well, the disengagement and reshoring in America, to me, even if it's done in a very well-planned and strategic way, takes decades. It's not something that can happen quickly, changing complete global supply chain. It doesn't seem to make any sense.
Well, we both know the figures for, what $560 billion worth of imports that went from China to the US in the last year, and I can't remember what the figure is the other way around, but it's another 300 billion or something. We both know the figures of what American companies or European companies sell in domestic Chinese markets. So, I mean, that's kind of the crux of where we're going to get to, isn't it, really?
Take, for example, when Apple Computer tried to assemble its MacBook computers in Austin, Texas, they found the screws have to come from China. It's to change. Yep. I don't see Pittsburgh making screws again. It's a.
I mean, look, I completely agree with you. It's going to take 10 years to tell what the impact of this approach is. But I suppose I would just make the point that Biden's got a pretty clever group of people around him. I think they're really impressive. And I think that they are bold, and they're going for a really bold strategic approach. I've got lots of connectivity to the US like you have, but I suppose I'd just make the point the US really does have the wind in its sails, and it would be wrong to not realize that. Time's going to tell, Charles. Time's going to tell what the reality is. But
in terms of economy and profitability, there's no question that the war in Ukraine has actually the biggest benefactor is actually the U.S. in terms of its selling of LNG, its oil prices, and Exxon announcing $40 billion in profits, and so on. Right? I mean,
look, I think these are secondary issues. I really do believe that. This is going to be one of those occasions where we will politely agree to disagree, I think. But the US policy to Ukraine is categorically not driven by economic self-interest. In the same way that for Europeans, it's categorically not in our economic self-interest to be supporting this thing. But we're doing it because there is a belief in something else about this. You're absolutely right that the US, with its self-sufficiency for energy and with its booming sort of military industry, of course the secondary benefits. But look, Charles, that could apply. I could turn that around and say, China had no involvement of this, but China's been a beneficiary of cheap oil and gas from Russia, right? There are secondary impacts that come from what's
And
the main.
India too.
India the same, yeah, yeah. But I would strongly make the case that that's all secondary stuff. So,
Let's go to another very tricky question. China-US relations. I remember last time when we spoke, you were quite upset about how things were moving, what direction things were moving, given what Blinken had been saying about red line.
very
What do
depressing.
you think?
I'm practical. I try and be non-ideological. I've had an extraordinary experience of the last 20 years. I feel it's been a privilege to be, witness and in a very small way exposed to a great event of world history, which has been China's reemergence. And I've spent 150 trips to Beijing, most often seeing you when I rock up. It's been exciting. I've witnessed an extraordinary event unfolding and taking place, and I'm profoundly worried the next 20 years or the next few years is going to be very different to the last 20 years. It feels to me like at some point we've got to move into a point where serious diplomacy has got to take over. There has to be some sort of a sit down with yellow post-it notes by people who really, 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 really matter, and figuring out where our interests can intersect and how we can, coalesce slightly better. Because I feel very depressed right now. How can we not? The people are being forced into, completely different positions. I mean, in my small world, I run my China Europe conferences and passionately try and create platforms for engagement, which I've done for 20 years. The kind of activity which I would do in Europe for the last 20 years, it's a very different environment right now. And this is all being set by the political tailwinds really driven by the US-China relationship. Yeah, there's a lot to be depressed about right now.
Well, at the same time, I am a little more optimistic than you are, because I think ultimately the world has gone into such a phase in which the interdependence will dawn on everyone that if Walmart is 50% of their products come from China, you can't disengage from China for the US population. And then as the world opens up after COVID, there will be a lot more exchanges, and hopefully there will be a lot more visitors to China and a lot more visitors from China abroad to have face-to-face conversation rather than this online business, which serves a purpose, but it's not the same as face-to-face. I think we've had a situation in which, unfortunately, the media has played a rather negative role because grabbing onto things that will sell papers or sell data flow is usually catchy, but you have to have an enemy, you have to have negativity, you
Yeah,
got to have all of those things which attract people's eyeballs, but not necessarily do good for the rest of the world. Now,
yeah,
going back to what we said, what we were talking about before, one of the reasons why there's a shortage of fruit and vegetables, I think not only in the UK, but also in other parts of Europe, is partly the disruption of the supply chain and the production supply chain as
yeah,
well, but also partly, I think, because of climate change. There's been some serious issues that's been brought about with climate change in terms of flooding, in terms of drought, in terms of incredibly high temperature. I think some parts of North Africa was hitting 50 degrees centigrade, again, breaking all kinds of records. So these are things which I think it's unfortunate that the press doesn't give it the coverage that it really deserves. This is something that I think the rest of the world should really get together and talk about. And this
yeah.
is hopefully China, Europe, and the US can together take the lead on in addressing.
I completely agree with you, Charles. I mean, in the end, why there's no point squabbling over certain issues of territory or all the rest of it. If the planet we live in is scorched and unlivable in, you're of course completely right. But we're going through and I think the last 3 years have been extraordinarily damaging. And I think that, I'm fortunate and I've got a wonderful Chinese network like you, people I know who know me, and we've been able to just pick up online. But imagine for most Europeans who only really knew China perhaps from going there, or didn't really have any kind of relationships that they could pick up on. It's just created it's chopped it off, lopped it off. So there are some very, very deep missing holes of communication at the moment, which hopefully can be repaired. So hopefully, when people start meeting, exchanging, and our politicians in particular, then we can avoid these, angry exchanges in Iceland or Munich. That will, we can try and find a more constructive basis. But the world needs to move to the point where carve out areas which are too difficult, but focus. And obviously, you're completely right. How can we not put climate change, all of us, as that, it clearly has to be our number one objective. But it's going to be difficult. It's going to be difficult, Charles, until this tragedy in Ukraine is solved. That's what worries me.
I look forward to your coming, and when you're in Beijing in a couple of weeks, hopefully, we can sit in the room and do another program, and hopefully we can be both more positive, optimistic. Thank you very much, Matthew. See you soon.
See you, Charles.
Bye bye.